You know how some memories just stick with you, not in a good way, but like a splinter under your skin that you can't get out? That's what this whole thing feels like to me. It happened back in the summer of '98, when I was 19. I just finished my first year of college and was feeling pretty invincible, you know? The plan was to drive a few hundred miles up north to my uncle's cabin, spend a week fishing, and just being disconnected from the world. My ride was this beat-up old Ford Falcon that my dad helped me fix up. It was a hunk of metal, all rusty and rattling, but to me, it was freedom. My life was pretty simple back then. Classes, a part-time job at a hardware store, and a lot of late nights with friends. I felt like the world was wide open, and I was just starting to explore it, but that naive confidence was about to get a serious reality check. The storm came out of nowhere, not like a regular summer shower, but one of those biblical tempests with a sky that looked like bruised charcoal and lightning that lit up the whole landscape like a strobe light. That I was on this old, narrow country road, the kind that snakes through miles of dense, overgrown forest with not a single house in sight. The rain was coming down in sheets, so thick my wipers couldn't keep up, and the wind was howling through the trees, making them sway and creak like giant skeletons. Then, just as I was trying to navigate a particularly sharp bend, the old Falcon sputtered and died. The engine gave out with a final, heartbreaking cough, and a thick plume of smoke started rising from under the hood. I was completely stranded, the only sound being the furious drumming of the rain on the car roof and the distant rumble of thunder. Panic started to set in, a cold, sharp feeling in my gut. I knew I couldn't stay in the car. It felt like a tin can in a hurricane. I had to find shelter, and fast. That's when I saw it. A small, dark shape barely visible through the downpour. A house a little ways off the road, nestled in a clearing. It looked old, maybe even abandoned, but it was a building, a refuge, and at that moment, that was all that mattered to me. The walk from the road to the house was a nightmare. The wind was so strong it felt like it was trying to rip the backpack right off my shoulders, and the rain turned the ground into a treacherous, squishy mess of mud and leaves. Each lightning flash was a brief, blinding moment of clarity, revealing the twisted, gnarled shapes of the trees that seemed to be reaching out, their bare branches like skeletal fingers. I finally made it to a rickety-looking porch and stumbled up the steps, my body aching with a cold that went straight to the bone. The front door, a heavy thing of peeling black paint and rusted iron, creaked open with an agonizing groan when I pushed on it. Inside, it was pitch black, a thick, suffocating darkness that smelled of dust, mold, and something else, something sweet and cloying, like old, forgotten flowers left to rot that I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow, shaky path through the gloom. The light fell on a main living area that was a complete wreck. Furniture was overturned. A thick layer of dust covered everything like a blanket, and there were cobwebs hanging in long, silky strands from every corner. The place was a mausoleum of someone else's life, a time capsule of an abrupt and long-ago departure. What struck me first was the wallpaper, a gaudy, faded floral pattern with these strange, almost unsettlingly symmetrical roses, each one looking like it was staring back at me with a tiny, swirling center. It was so out of place in this scene of decay, almost too perfect. As I moved the light across the room, it caught something else. On the wall, just above the fireplace, a family portrait hung askew, its glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The faces in the picture were blurred with age and moisture, but I could make out a family, a mother, a father, and two small children, all of them with smiles that seemed just a little too wide, a little too fixed. My eyes were drawn to the portrait, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something wrong with it, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The two kids, a boy and a girl, had these eyes, not just blurred, but almost smudged, like someone had tried to erase them. It was a small detail, but it twisted my stomach into a knot. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an old, damaged photograph, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. As the thunder rumbled outside, I heard a new sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird. It was so out of place in the silent, dead house. I tried to rationalize it, a loose shutter, a tree branch hitting the roof, but the tapping was too steady, too deliberate to be a natural sound. It was like a metronome, counting down to something. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the beam of my flashlight shaking with my hand. I told myself to just sit tight, wait out the storm, but the tapping from upstairs was getting louder, and the silence in between each tap felt like a pressure against my eardrums. I couldn't ignore it. With a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, I started to move toward the staircase. It was a grand, sweeping thing with a polished banister that felt eerily smooth under my fingertips, a stark contrast to the rest of the decaying house. Each step I took groaned under my weight, the sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. As I reached the top of the stairs, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound itself. I stood there, flashlight aimed down a long, dark hallway, a cold dread creeping up my spine. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence, something heavy and watchful, just beyond the reach of my light. My breath hitched in my throat as I heard a soft, scraping sound from one of the rooms down the hall. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like fingernails dragging across a wooden floor. The dread I felt was no longer a cold feeling, but a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I pointed the flashlight beam toward the sound source, a half-open door at the very end of the hall. The light fell upon a small room, what looked like a child's bedroom, but everything was meticulously arranged. A little rocking horse sat perfectly still in the middle of the room, and a doll with cracked porcelain skin was propped up on a bed with a lace blanket, its eyes fixed on the doorway. But it was what was on the walls that made me gasp and stumble back. The floral wallpaper from downstairs was in here too, but something had been done to it. The roses were no longer perfect. They were scratched out, and in their place, someone or something had etched countless, frenzied lines. Lines that weren't just random marks, but formed something, a person. Dozens of crudely drawn stick figures, all with those same smudged, empty eyes I saw in the portrait, were scribbled across the wall. They looked like they were running, all of them pointing toward the rocking horse, and then toward me. The scraping sound started again, and I saw the doll's head slowly, so slowly, tilt to the side. The hollow, empty sockets where its eyes should have been seemed to stare right through me. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, slithered through the air, and it sounded like a little girl's voice, full of a cold, childish glee, saying, "You found us." That's when the terror became a living thing, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The doll's head tilted further, and the air in the room grew heavy and thick, making it hard to breathe. I could see the faint outline of something moving behind the rocking horse, a small, hunched shape that wasn't there a moment ago. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of this place, but my feet were rooted to the floor. I felt like an actor in a horror movie, trapped in a moment of pure dread. The whispering started again, louder this time, and I could hear two distinct voices, one high and childlike, the other a little deeper. They were giggling. "He's scared," one of them said. "He's just like the others," the other finished. The walls seemed to close in, and the smudged eyes of the stick figures felt like 100 tiny pinpricks on my skin. I could feel their presence all around me, not just in the room, but in the walls, in the dust, in the very air I was trying to suck into my lungs. I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the doll and the rocking horse, my gaze darting around the room, desperate for an escape. The doorway I had come through now seemed a million miles away. Then, another sound, different from the whispers and the scraping, reached me. It was the sound of the front door downstairs, groaning open with that same rusty complaint it had made when I first entered. I heard a slow, heavy thud on the floorboards, followed by a dragging sound. Something was coming up the stairs. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, frantic rhythm. I knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that whatever was coming was not human. The giggling from the children's room intensified, a cruel, mocking sound. They were enjoying this. They were waiting. My body was screaming at me, but my mind was blank, consumed by a pure, primal terror. The low, guttural moan echoed from the foot of the stairs, and I could hear the distinct sound of a body dragging itself, slow and methodical, across the floorboards. The giggling from the children's room turned into a full-blown cackle. I finally found my voice, a desperate, hoarse scream, and stumbled backward, my hand flailing behind me until it found the cold, hard surface of the wall. My fingers brushed against a small, metal latch, the kind you'd find on an old pantry door. Without a second thought, I pushed it, and a small, narrow door swung inward. It was a utility closet filled with dusty brooms and forgotten rags, but it was a hiding place. I scrambled inside, pulling the door shut behind me, plunging myself into a new, suffocating darkness. I held my breath, my entire body rigid with fear, listening to the horrifying sounds outside the closet door. The dragging sound was getting closer, punctuated by the high-pitched, gleeful whispers. I could hear them now, right outside the closet. "He's hiding, Daddy," one of the voices said, their tone full of twisted amusement. "He's in the little room," the other one added. The silence that followed was the worst part. I could feel something pressing against the door, a heavy, silent weight. Then, a single, sharp tap on the wood, right in front of my face. It was the same rhythm I had heard from upstairs, but now it was personal. I was trapped, a rat in a box, and they were playing with me. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face, and whispered a desperate prayer to anyone who might be listening, begging them to make it stop. The tapping turned into a scraping, and the door rattled violently in its frame. I felt something small and cold press against the wood, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it was a child's hand reaching for me. I could hear their tiny, excited whispers on the other side. "He's almost ours, Daddy." I pushed with all my might against the door, my muscles screaming in protest, but it was no use. The scraping and the shaking intensified, and I could hear the wood splintering, giving way under the relentless assault. Then, in the midst of my terror, a new sound cut through the noise, the blaring, high-pitched wail of a police siren. The sound was so loud, so sudden, that the scraping and the whispers stopped instantly. I heard a panicked, frantic shuffling outside the closet door, then a low, disappointed groan that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The dragging sound retreated, fast, followed by the sound of the children's laughter fading into the distance. I stayed in the closet for what felt like an hour, trembling and listening, until I finally heard the crunch of boots on the porch and a voice calling out, "Hello? Anyone in here?" I stumbled out of the closet, my legs weak, and saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser through the shattered front window. The officer, a young guy with a look of pure confusion on his face, helped me out of the house. I tried to explain, to tell him what I saw and heard, but the words wouldn't come out. The house was empty, just as it should have been. It had been abandoned for years, he told me. A family had died there, a long time ago, a terrible accident. The officer drove me to the nearest town, and I called my uncle. I never told anyone the whole story, not even my family. How could I? It sounds insane. I spent a week with my uncle, jumpy and paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. The nightmares were the worst part, replaying the terror of that night, but with one new, horrifying detail. The smudged eyes from the portrait, the ones that had been erased, were replaced with my own. I never drove that road again, and the memory of that house, with its perfectly terrible roses and its giggling children, is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a refuge that wasn't, a trap I barely escaped, and a reminder that some storms, no matter how hard you run, will always find you. I've never really been one to share stuff like this. I'm more of a lurker, you know? The guy who reads all the crazy stories late at night, feeling a little chill down his spine, but never thinking anything like that could ever happen to him. I was a student back in '08, living in this old, creaky apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My place was a shoebox, but it was mine, and the only thing I really cared about was that it was cheap and close to campus. My life was pretty simple back then. Classes, a part-time job at the library, and a lot of instant noodles. I was the type of person who planned out their entire week on a single sheet of notebook paper. So when something completely out of the ordinary happened, it threw my whole world off its axis. I've been carrying this with me for years, and I figure it's time to finally let it out, if only to a community that might actually believe me. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar, something that felt so unreal you had to question your own sanity. That night, it was one of those crazy storms that just seemed to come out of nowhere. The kind where the sky turns this weird, bruised purple-gray color and the air gets heavy and humid, almost thick enough to chew on. I remember I was trying to study for a midterm, but the rain was coming down so hard it was more like a wall of water hitting my window. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the old sash so violently I thought the glass was going to shatter. The power flickered a few times, just enough to make my laptop screen flash and send my heart into my throat. I ended up giving up on studying and just sat there, staring out the window, mesmerized by the chaos outside. The streetlights flickered and swayed, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the driving rain. It was beautiful, in a terrifying way, like watching a monster you knew you could never fight. That's when I saw it. Or, at least, that's when I thought I saw it. A few things happened at once, and it all melted together into this horrifying blur. The wind shrieked, the rain intensified, and the power flickered again, this time plunging the street into complete darkness for a second before the lights popped back on. In that brief moment of pitch black, something was there. A figure. It was standing under the single, swaying streetlight directly across the street from my window, where the light would hit it just right. It was tall, impossibly thin, almost like a scarecrow, and it was hunched over something on the ground. The way it was swaying, just slightly, made me think it was fighting the wind, but it wasn't. There was a deliberate, almost graceful movement to it. And the thing on the ground, I couldn't make out any details, but it was small. Too small to be a dog or a cat. It looked like a child's backpack, the kind with little reflective strips on the side. I just stared, my breath caught in my throat, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The lights came back on, a sickly yellow wash over the scene, and I saw a flash of movement. The figure bent over, and with a disturbingly gentle motion, it picked up the small shape from the ground. It was then that I saw the color of the jacket, a vibrant, almost neon yellow that stood out starkly against the dark, wet pavement. It was a kid, a little boy, and the figure was holding him like a rag doll. It was moving, but the movement was wrong, jerky and unnatural. The storm was so loud, but I swore I could hear something over the wind. A faint, muffled whimpering, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the downpour. My hands went to the window pane, pressing against the cold glass as if I could somehow feel what was happening outside. The figure turned slightly, and for a split second, I saw something about its face, something that made my stomach lurch. There was nothing there. No nose, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface, reflecting the streetlight like a warped funhouse mirror. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. My brain just shut down. It was like I was watching a movie where the sound was turned down and the screen was blurry. The figure, still holding the little boy, started to move, slowly, deliberately, not towards the main road, but towards the dark alleyway that ran alongside my apartment building. The alley was just a narrow gap between two brick walls, usually filled with overflowing trash cans and shadows. The storm's fury was a constant roar, a physical force that seemed to be pushing everything around. Yet this thing, this faceless entity, glided through it with an eerie lack of effort. My hand, still pressed against the glass, felt the vibrations of the wind, but my body felt completely disconnected. I tried to scream, to call out, to do anything, but the sound was trapped in my throat, a dry, choked gasp. All I could do was watch as the small, yellow form of the boy vanished into the blackness of the alley, a final flash of color swallowed by the endless gray and black of the night. And then, just as suddenly as it had come into view, the whole scene was gone. The figure, the boy, the little glimmer of yellow, all of it disappeared into the void of the alley. The power, which had been flickering like a dying heartbeat, went out for good this time, plunging my entire apartment into suffocating darkness. The only light was the occasional lightning flash, brief and violent, illuminating the rain-streaked window and my own horrified reflection. The roar of the storm was the only sound now, a deafening white noise that swallowed everything. I stood there in the dark, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Was it real? Was it a trick of the light, some bizarre hallucination brought on by the stress of the storm and my own sleeplessness? My mind was screaming at me to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation. But the memory of that smooth, featureless face and the small, limp body in the thing's arms was burned into my mind. I was a witness, and I had done nothing. I sat there in the dark, curled up in my cheap armchair, the cold from the window soaking into me. Every gust of wind, every sheet of rain against the glass, made me jump. My mind was racing replaying the scene over and over, trying to find a logical thread, a normal explanation. Maybe it was just a neighbor, someone helping a drunk friend? But the figure was too tall, too thin, and the movement was all wrong. And the face, the complete absence of a face. That was the detail that refused to be reasoned away. After what felt like an eternity, I finally grabbed my landline phone, the plastic receiver feeling heavy and foreign in my trembling hand. I stared at the keypad, my thumb hovering over the numbers. What was I going to say? Hi, I just saw a monster kidnap a child down the street. It sounded insane, even to me. But the image of that small, yellow jacket was a hook in my gut, a sharp, cold reminder that something truly awful had happened, regardless of what my brain was trying to tell me. I had to do something. I had to try. With a deep, shaky breath, I dialed 911. The line clicked and buzzed for a second before a calm, professional voice came through. 911, what is your emergency? The contrast between her measured tone and my panicked state was jarring. I stammered, my words jumbling together. I think I just saw something bad happen. A figure, a child. I tried to describe the scene, the storm, the faceless entity, the little boy in the bright yellow jacket, but as the words left my mouth, they sounded more and more absurd. The dispatcher, bless her heart, was patient. She asked for my address, the street name, any details I could give her about the people involved. My answers were vague, useless. It was under the streetlight, but it's dark now? The alleyway. The figure was just a shadow. I could hear the subtle change in her tone, the shift from a concerned operator to someone humoring a frantic, probably crazy person. She told me she'd send a patrol car to check out the area, but her voice was a flat, empty reassurance, like a canned response. As I hung up, a cold wave of shame washed over me. I had tried to tell someone, but the story was just too unbelievable. I was alone with this terrible secret, and the storm outside seemed to mock my helplessness. I sat there for what felt like an hour, staring into the blackness, my mind replaying the dispatcher's patronizing voice. The shame was a physical weight on my chest. I had tried to do the right thing, to tell someone, but the story was just too fantastical. My terror felt trivial and ridiculous. I was just some kid who got spooked by the storm. But just as I was about to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, I heard a new sound over the wind and the rain, the distinct wail of a distant siren, growing closer. A knot of dread twisted in my stomach. The patrol car. It pulled up directly in front of my building, its headlights cutting two stark beams through the pouring rain. The door opened and two figures in yellow rain slickers got out, their flashlights creating two dancing cones of light that swept across the pavement and up the side of my apartment. It was a normal, routine sight, two cops doing their job, but to me, it felt like an inspection of my sanity. They moved with a calm, practiced efficiency, their flashlights crisscrossing the street, illuminating puddles and fallen leaves. One of them walked to the mouth of the alley I had pointed out, his light probing the darkness for a full minute before he came back. They talked for a moment, their voices a low murmur that I couldn't hear over the storm, before they simply got back in their car. They turned around, their headlights sweeping across my window one last time, and then they were gone, the red and blue flashing lights swallowed by the dark, wet street. And just like that, it was over. The siren faded, and the silence that followed, broken only by the now softening rain, was the most chilling thing of all. They had found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no little yellow jacket, no evidence of anything at all. The terror of what I had seen was now compounded by a new, more insidious kind of horror, the crushing weight of knowing I was the only witness to something so unspeakably wrong, and that no one would ever believe me. The storm was over, but for me, the darkness was just beginning. The next morning, the world was back to normal, a sickeningly bright and quiet normal. The sun was out, the streets were being swept clean of debris, and the power was back on. My landlord, a bubbly old lady with too much perfume, knocked on my door to ask if everything was okay. I just mumbled something about being fine and closed the door. My first instinct was to confirm what I had seen. I fired up my laptop, my fingers shaking as I typed "missing child" and the date into the search bar. I scrolled through every local news report, every blog post, every community forum. I searched for stories about the storm, for strange happenings, anything. But there was nothing. Not a single report of a missing boy, not a word about any bizarre incident. The world just went on as if that entire horrifying event had never occurred. The silence was louder than the storm itself. It was the moment the true, lasting horror set in. The realization that I was the only one who saw it, and that the only proof I had was my own crumbling sanity. That apartment became a prison. The window I had once loved to sit by was now a portal to a nightmare I couldn't escape. I moved out the next month, as soon as my lease allowed, getting a new place on the other side of town with no view of the street. But it didn't help. The image of that faceless figure and the small boy in the yellow jacket is burned into my mind, a permanent scar. Years have passed, and I still flinch when I see a flash of yellow in my periphery, my heart lurching into my throat. The sound of a heavy storm is no longer beautiful to me. It's a deafening shroud that I associate with utter helplessness and silent terror. I've searched the internet countless times since, hoping for a cold case, a grainy photo, some scrap of information to validate what I saw. I never found anything. I am an involuntary witness to a crime that, for all intents and purposes, never happened. The worst part isn't the monster I saw. It's the fact that I'm alone in knowing it exists, and that my secret is just a story no one will ever believe. I was about 15. That was a weird time for me. My parents had just split, and my dad, a quiet man who found solace in tinkering with anything electronic, had moved us into his grandmother's old farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those places that felt like it was breathing. The walls groaned, the floorboards sighed, and every night, the wind would whisper secrets through the gaps in the window frames. The house was a time capsule, really. My great-grandmother, bless her heart, had been a hoarder of sorts, but with a specific, almost curated taste for old electronics. The attic was a labyrinth of forgotten gadgets, phonographs with massive horns, televisions with rounded screens that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi movie, and a whole collection of radios. My dad, being the tech-obsessed guy he was in heaven. He spent most of his days up there, surrounded by dusty wires and Bakelite knobs, trying to bring these relics back to life. He was a man of few words, and this was his way of coping, I guess. He'd put on his old, grease-stained apron, grab a soldering iron, and just disappear into his own world of circuits and static. Me? I was mostly just trying to survive being a teenager in a place where the closest neighbor was a scarecrow on a pole a mile down the road. It was suffocatingly quiet, a kind of silence that feels heavy and oppressive, like it's waiting for something to happen. I spent my days just counting the seconds until nightfall, when the darkness would swallow the endless fields, and the only light would be the moon casting long, distorted shadows on the old, peeling wallpaper of my room. The air always felt charged, thick with a strange sort of anticipation. Then came the storm. It wasn't just a regular summer thunderstorm with a bit of rain and some distant rumbling. This was something else entirely. The sky turned a sickly, bruised purple, and the wind started howling like a living thing trying to tear the house apart. The lightning wasn't just flashes. It was these massive, blinding white strokes that would hit so close you could feel the ground shake and the air crackle with a weird, metallic ozone smell. The power flickered and died, plunging the whole house into a sudden, inky blackness. It was the kind of darkness that felt heavy, almost solid, and the only light we had was the weak, sputtering beam of a flashlight my dad kept by the back door. The sound was deafening. The rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists, and every lightning strike illuminated the frantic, dancing shadows of the trees outside, making them look like skeletal hands clawing at the windows. It was terrifying, and for the first time since we'd moved in, I felt a deep, primal fear that had nothing to do with the loneliness of the place. My dad, however, seemed strangely calm. He just clicked off the flashlight, saving the battery, and said, "Might as well go up to the attic. The silence is getting to me." And he wasn't kidding. The storm wasn't a silence, but in a weird way, it was a silence from the usual routine, the quiet hum of electricity, the low thrum of the fridge. He took the lantern and started heading up the creaky stairs. I followed, not wanting to be left alone in the dark house with all the creaking and groaning. The attic was even more chaotic in the dim lantern light. Shadows stretched and shrank, making the stacks of old junk look like grotesque sculptures. My dad found a small, old radio with a crank on the side, one of those beautiful, mahogany-colored ones with intricate dials. He called it the Traveler. He'd been trying to fix it for weeks, but it was a total bust, a beautiful antique that was now just a fancy paperweight. He started cranking the handle, a rhythmic, grating noise that was somehow a bit comforting amidst the storm's fury. The light on the radio flickered to life, a faint, amber glow, but all it produced was a harsh, hissing static, a white noise that filled the space with a weird, buzzing energy that seemed to hum in sync with the lightning strikes. We were just sitting there in the semi-darkness, listening to the monotonous hiss of the static, when a bolt of lightning hit somewhere incredibly close. The whole house shuddered, and a brilliant, searing white light filled the attic for a split second, casting our long, distorted shadows against the low ceiling. I swear I heard the sound of glass breaking from somewhere downstairs, but the immediate aftershock was what caught our attention. The hiss from the radio suddenly changed. It wasn't just static anymore. There was a rhythm to it, a strange, stuttering crackle like a skipping record, and then a voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper lost in the white noise, but it was there. It sounded old, like it was coming from a tin can at the bottom of a well, full of echoes and weird distortions, but it was undeniably human. My dad's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated fascination. He started messing with the dials, his fingers moving with a frantic urgency I hadn't seen in him since before the split. He was muttering to himself, "It's not possible. This radio hasn't picked up a signal in decades." The voice got a little clearer, and it was a woman's voice. It was low and raspy, almost like she was breathing through a straw. It had a strange, hypnotic cadence, and what it was saying didn't make a lick of sense at first. The words were jumbled, almost like it was a recording playing backward and forward at the same time. The storm, watch, the children not real. It was a stream of disjointed phrases, all spoken with an urgency that felt like a punch to the gut. We leaned closer, both of us captivated and terrified, trying to make out the words. The lightning flashes outside were now perfectly timed with the voice's pauses, as if the storm itself was a conductor for this bizarre broadcast. A sharp, loud crack of thunder, then a clear, chilling sentence would cut through the static. "The house, they are inside." The voice's warning sent a cold shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. My dad, despite his shock, was still a man of logic and reason. He tried to explain it away. "It's just some old ham radio operator. The storm's messing with the signal." But I knew, deep down, that wasn't it. The words weren't a broadcast. They were a whisper meant for us, a secret riding the very air itself. The woman's voice grew more frantic, almost hysterical, and it started repeating a single phrase over and over. "Don't open the door. Don't let them in." We both looked towards the main door, a heavy, dark-wood thing that felt a million miles away. Outside, the wind howled a counterpoint to her desperate pleas, and the rattling of the old glass panes seemed to be getting louder, more insistent. It felt like something out there was trying to get in, and this woman, trapped in some kind of temporal feedback loop on our old radio, was trying to stop us from making a terrible mistake. My dad, with a look of pale determination, put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed it. "Stay here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm just going to check the lock." He picked up the flashlight and started moving away from the radio, and as he did, the voice on the radio started to scream. It wasn't a static-filled scream, but a piercing, bone-chilling cry that sounded like pure agony. It echoed in the small attic, a sound that felt both impossibly close and infinitely far away. And as soon as his hand touched the doorknob at the bottom of the attic stairs, the scream cut off abruptly. Silence fell over the house, a sudden, heavy silence that was even more terrifying than the storm's roar. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. My dad froze, his hand still on the knob, and we both just stood there, suspended in a moment of pure dread. The only thing we could hear was the frantic beating of our own hearts, a drumline of fear in the suffocating quiet. The amber light on the radio died out, and the attic plunged back into a profound, suffocating darkness. My dad slowly, deliberately, pulled his hand away from the doorknob as if it were burning him. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked back to me, the weak flashlight beam bobbing and dancing on the walls. The air was thick with the unsaid, with the silent question of what that scream had been, of what had just been prevented. We stood side by side, our shoulders touching, two terrified souls in a dark house. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, but I could feel the tremor in his body, a silent confession of a fear I'd never seen him express before. It was a raw, naked fear that mirrored my own. We just stayed there, in that cold, pitch-black attic, for what felt like hours. The storm eventually began to fade, the lightning growing more distant, the wind's wail softening into a weary sigh as the morning light began to bleed through the attic windows, casting long, dusty shafts of gold. A sense of relief washed over me. The magic, or whatever it was gone. The world was returning to normal. My dad, without a word, walked back to the radio. He tried to crank the handle again, but nothing happened. The amber light remained dark, the dials lifeless. It was just a beautiful, dead piece of junk again. He ran a hand over the smooth wood and gave a sigh, a mix of disappointment and relief. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't need to. We just knew. That night, something had tried to get in, and for some reason, that old radio had become a lifeline to someone who had lived through the same nightmare before and was desperately trying to warn us. The house itself had a secret, a dark history that the storm had briefly forced to the surface, and it was a history that wanted to repeat itself. That day, my dad went straight to the hardware store and came back with a heavy-duty deadbolt. He installed it on the front door himself, the rhythmic grinding of the drill a stark contrast to the silence of the night before. I watched him, a silent understanding passing between us. It wasn't just a lock anymore. It was a physical barrier against something we couldn't comprehend. He didn't stop there. He went through every window and every door, reinforcing them with whatever he could find, a frantic, almost desperate need to secure our fortress. Every bang of the hammer was a statement, a silent promise that whatever had tried to get in, whatever had whispered through the static, wouldn't find a way back in. We both acted like it was just a strange incident caused by the storm, something we could rationally explain away with unusual atmospheric conditions or faulty wiring. But the look in our eyes when we passed each other in the hallway told a different story. We never spoke of the incident again, not directly anyway. The radio sat on the mantelpiece, a silent, beautiful reminder of that terrifying night. My dad never tried to fix it again. It was as if he was afraid of what it might say next. We both knew, in our hearts, that we had been given a second chance, a warning from a victim of the past. The house, our new home, felt different after that. The groaning and creaking sounds weren't just old house noises anymore. They were whispers, echoes of something that had happened long ago, of a tragedy that was waiting to repeat itself. I'd sometimes catch myself holding my breath, listening for a faint, crackling voice in the hum of the fridge or the low buzz of the lamps. The fear never truly left me. It just changed, becoming a permanent, low-level dread that lived in the corners of every room. We eventually moved out a few years later, but to this day, whenever a severe storm rolls in, I get this cold, crawling sensation on my skin, and the first thing I do is check all the locks on every door and window, just to be sure that my dad sold the house to a young couple a few years after that. He told me he was moving to a smaller place, but I think he just couldn't live with the silence of the house anymore, with the ghosts we both felt lurking in the shadows. He never mentioned the radio again, but when he gave me the keys to his new apartment, he also gave me a small, wrapped box. Inside was the old radio, the Traveler. He just said, "You might need this one day." I keep it on a shelf in my living room now. It's still broken. Of course, a quiet monument to a night that changed me forever. I've never tried to turn it on, and I never will. I just hope that whatever was trying to reach us that night, whatever was trapped in the past, has finally found some peace. But I'm always looking over my shoulder during a storm, just in case. The experience taught me that some doors should stay closed, and some voices should remain lost to time.